Bekah, hi. Welcome to the Happy Engineer podcast. Glad you're here.
Hey, I'm so happy to be here. Thanks for having me, Zach.
You're welcome. You're welcome. So before I hit record, we had a funny interchange about Mondays, and I'd love to circle back to that really quick. We're recording this the Tuesday after Memorial Day, and you were like, oof, all holidays that are on Mondays should be on Fridays. And I loved it. So tell me, what's your relationship to Monday?
Yeah, I love Mondays. That's like back on schedule. I know what I'm doing that day, and this is where my momentum starts. So when there's a holiday on a Monday, I have a hard time telling my brain that my Tuesday can be my Monday. It just doesn't want to accept that. And so then it automatically feels like I'm behind. So I'd
Hmm.
rather move Monday holidays to Fridays because then I'm fine to embrace the weekend and start over on Mondays.
So if we were writing code for your subconscious to accept Tuesday as a Monday, your brain is rejecting that line of code. Like that does
For
not
sure.
compile.
There's a bug in there. Somebody's
Okay.
got to squash it.
Okay. Well, for anybody who is with me and Bekah on Monday's Rock to start the week strong, we're going to start a petition for holidays that fall on Monday to be on Fridays instead. That's the plan.
100%.
I love that. Well, Bekah, I'm excited to get into your story. When we first met, the whole narrative of what got you into this place of influence in technology and in developing and your heart for developers is so unique. I've talked to a lot of people on the podcast and off, and everybody has a unique story. How did they end up falling in love with engineering or coding in the first place? But yours is pretty one of a kind, and I'm excited. But before we talk about developing, maybe take us back to your original, degree and work that you got into first and kind of why that happened. So tell us where it began.
I spent 10 years as a college English teacher. I was an adjunct, and I never really had any plans to change. I enjoyed what I was doing. I spent a lot of time reading and teaching reading. And in my heart, I will always be an educator.
I
And
love that.
so it was a big surprise to me when I made the change. And it wasn't something that I took lightly, but it started because I went through a trauma with my fourth child, and it just kind of flipped my world upside down.
Hmm. So before we talk about that flip, were you the kind of teacher who would ask me to read a 300-page classic British novel and then expect me to comprehend and tell you about it the next day in class?
No, definitely. I'm definitely not one of those
Okay.
teachers. So we would
What?
take a good period of time to break it down and talk through it together. And I know I had some students, we would always read Shakespeare, it was required. And I know that that can be really challenging for a lot of students. And so there are resources online. Never Fear Shakespeare is what I'm thinking of. So on one side, it has it written in plain English. On the other side, it has like it written from Shakespeare, and it gives that translation. And I would tell them, like, hey, the first thing that I want you to do is to understand what you're reading. So why don't you start there? And if
Hmm.
you can't get to the other side of understanding this semester, that's okay, but at least try it. So for me, it was all about like everybody's journey is going to look different. And what's important is that I'm equipping you with the tools that make sense for you at that point to be able to understand it.
I love that. That educator mindset coming out right there. Understand first. We could probably do the whole rest of the episode just on that principle as it relates to our engineering careers. But what was your favorite literature? I mean, is Shakespeare your jam? Did you have a favorite couple of books you always taught? Tell us about that.
Probably my favorite to teach was Crime and Punishment. And it's kind of interesting. We homeschooled my 13-year-old last semester. And so the novel that he's writing his final paper on is Crime and Punishment. And so I just sent him the prompt from my freshman in college English. So it's like,
Wow.
a big difference there. But hey, he's going to be writing on it. What I love so much about that book is the humanity that's brought forth in that. And I really like to explore the brokenness of humanity, but how we can overcome that brokenness, how we can unite ourselves to other people who are not like us, and how we can all work together to really understand that at the core we are on the same team, and we should be amplifying each other, we should be lifting each other up, and we should be finding ways to forgive ourselves and to forgive others as part of that journey to becoming part of the positive effects on humanity.
Hmm. That's awesome. I have a feeling that thread may come back later in our chat as well. But tell us then, your life is going well. You're loving teaching English. You have this passion for the written word, and then life takes a turn. You mentioned going through a trauma, and Bekah, whatever you feel comfortable sharing. But what happened?
So when I was delivering my fourth, after actually I had delivered her, you have to move from the birthing room into another room. And when I stood up, I knew like I was in the most pain that I had ever experienced in my entire life. And I had all of these side effects suddenly. I mean, I've never been stabbed, but I could pretty confidently say that this would probably be along that same line of the pain that I was feeling in my abdomen. And I kept telling them, like, something is wrong, something is wrong. And the doctor said, hey, you're a mom of four. Sometimes strange things like this happen. And I thought, I continue to have these symptoms. This isn't normal. And then instead of really helping me, they just dismissed my concerns and they discharged me. And they said, well, let us know on Monday if you're still having these problems. I had the problems over the weekend and I called them. Initially, they told me to go to the emergency room and then they told me not to go to the emergency room. They said, if you go, they're just going to separate you from your baby and you're not going to get any care. So I didn't go. I went on Monday to see my OBGYN and I said, I'm still having these issues. And she said to me, well, you're not my problem. And in that moment, I felt the most alone that I ever had in my entire life, because I wasn't a person, I was a problem, and I was not her problem. So when you are at your most vulnerable and the person that you trust to help you tells you that, it's like you're sucked into a dark hole of loneliness.
Oh.
Like, what am I supposed to do? You know, I can't live. I remember going home and just like shutting the door and sitting down on the floor and thinking like, I can't live my life like this. And so I was very lucky because I have a very supportive family who was willing to seek out resources, to call in favors, to help me out and to keep pushing, because I wasn't in a situation that was livable. It wasn't something that I could go on. And, had I not explored my options, I probably would have come upon some major medical complications and it wouldn't have turned out well. So with all that, I did weeks later find some other doctors. They discovered that I had a hole the size of a 50-cent piece between two of my organs. They had ruptured into each other and formed a tunnel. So not something that happens to a normal mom of four.
No, not normal at all. Wow.
Yeah.
There's that part of me that is trying to imagine or understand in any way what that might be like. And of course, Bekah, I have no idea. Every dimension of what you just described is beyond my comprehension. Not being a mom, just all of what's involved in having your fourth child and the challenge and emotion related to that, both love and joy and just the real pain and challenge. Oh, and then to walk in that room and be told you're not my problem when you're in pain and you know that this is not right and people won't listen, that breaks my heart for you. I'm so sorry you had to go through that. Praise the Lord for your amazing family, for people supporting you. You got support and you're here today and amazing. But that kind of dark hole that you described that you got pulled into, I can just almost picture you on the floor in your room, like just how dark of a place that feels. It sounds like that affected you for more than just that moment. So what happened? Like, tell us about the journey that came from that.
Sure. There's a little bit more. So after I had to have surgery to repair the issue. And I also overdosed on morphine in the hospital because I didn't have my morphine pump properly capped. And so I had to be treated with Narcan, which meant all of the effects of the morphine went away after having major abdominal surgery. And I was just not breathing. And luckily my husband was there and told the nurses like, hey, not really breathing. We've got to do something. And so coming out of that experience, I went home and I had PTSD. I started having anxiety attacks for the first time ever. I was counting my breaths to make sure that I wasn't stopping breathing because I was just
Yeah.
terrified. And it wasn't rational. And that was the first thing I was able to identify it fairly quickly as a panic attack because my husband had shared his experience and I knew it wasn't rational, but I could not talk my brain out of it. And so
Yeah.
I felt betrayed by my body. I felt betrayed by my brain, and I just felt really broken. And in the midst of that, I was still teaching every day online. And I received an email, I think at some point asking me, like, hey, I heard you were in the hospital. Are you still okay to keep teaching? I was like, I think I'm done with this. And my husband was a second career engineer. And he said to me at some point, this was probably 6 to 8 months later, he said, why don't you learn how to code? And I thought, you've got to be kidding me. Like, I can't even hold a thought. Like, I can
Yeah.
barely get a sentence out. All of that experience just kept repeating through my mind every day. And so he kept suggesting it. And I finally said, fine, like, I will try free code camp and then you will stop asking me. But
That's the deal.
what I found is when I started free code camp, all of those cycling thoughts stopped. And so for the first time in almost a year, I had quiet in my brain. And I felt like I could navigate through life. And I thought that, hey, this seems doable. And so what started as my husband encouraging me to do something became a hobby, became a community of people, and then eventually became a career. It just got to the point where I made that decision. This seems like the place for me. And I found so much healing in that experience. I did go to boot camp, and during boot camp, my educational coach, she shared with me that she had been through a trauma. And she said, hey, Beck, I read your essay and I want to know if you care if I share my story. And she did. She had been run over by a semi truck and they didn't know if she was going to live. They didn't think she would ever walk again. They didn't think
Oh
that she would
my.
have kids. Her daughter just turned 1 this year. And what I found from that experience was that I had been living in this loneliness, thinking that I was the only one that could understand the trauma that I had been through because it doesn't happen to people. It happens to less than 1% of women in the world. And most of them do not live in the United States. But she was saying the same words that I thought to myself. She had the same expressions, and my understanding of trauma totally changed from that point. I finally felt like I'm not alone. And so for me, moving into tech, that's been kind of the primary focus. I don't want anybody to feel as alone as I did in those moments.
Wow.
And I've carried that with me.
It may be a bit painful to go into this question, and if you don't want to, then say no, Bekah. But I know a lot of leaders who've experienced either as an after effect of a trauma or just the compounding of difficult circumstances in their life, and they have that panic attack experience. And a lot of times at the beginning, there is some shame or doubt or just a question of like what's happening and hesitancy to seek help or to talk about that, or to almost a fear to go understand what's happening because we don't really want to know what's on the other side of that door. And I've not experienced that, but would you be open to sharing a little bit of what that's like if somebody might be wondering, is that what's going on for me?
Yeah, sure. And I think it's different for a lot of different people. My husband had panic attacks and he still has them occasionally, but so he had shared his experience with me. And so I can understand, some people, it's often mistaken for a heart attack, like the heart's racing, your breath increases. In my mind, I just continued to think that I was going to stop breathing and I was going to die. And my mind was like very fixated on that thing. And so a lot of it can be bound up in that anxiety. And there was nothing that I could do to talk myself out of it. And so, you talk about that shame or mention it. And I definitely felt that as part of the experience because I'm like, why can't I just stop? I know
Yeah.
that this is not rational, but I can't talk myself out of it. It doesn't make sense. And I think that it's important to realize like it's not necessarily something that you control. Like it might be a physiological response to something that's really triggering, and that there's very little that you can do to bring yourself out of it. It's not about mental willpower. It's not about strength. It's not about any of that stuff. And so there shouldn't be shame around experiencing that. It's about like finding the resources that you can tap into to help you move through that experience.
Yeah. So go tap into those resources if you find yourself in that place. Thank you for sharing that, Bekah. So tell us about the coding and the boot camp. You had this very new experience of a quiet mind, or at least new since experiencing this trauma. Was it a kind of a love at first line of code? Like really shifted quickly, or was it something that developed as you pursued this and over time you started to experience that? Like, how did that work?
I mean, I think the quietness really got me hooked because it really felt like therapy at that point. You know, I was getting some relief from all of these cycling thoughts. And then I started tweeting about it pretty early on. And what I found was there were people on Twitter who I didn't know who were cheering me on. I'm like, what is this? This does not happen in academia, right? Like nobody was ever cheering me on. And so to have that connection with people that I didn't know, and people even saying online, never met these people. Hey, if you get stuck, let me know and we can pair up. And I was like, what is happening? People are nice. So then it just that idea of community and growing and learning more. I'm from small town Ohio. I don't really get out, or I didn't prior to being in tech because I'm a mom of 4 kids, really busy, got a lot of stuff going on. I can't really take time to go to meetups. The closest one's probably an hour away. And so there wasn't really community for tech here, but I found this online community of people that was amazing. And I was telling one of my kids earlier today that I'm getting much better with time zones because of all of the work that I do with developers all across the world and getting those experiences, learning about them and their cultures and their approaches to things. So it's really been a huge blessing to be able to progress in this journey and meet all of these different people and find this community. And so I think like once I really found that community, it became kind of a less complicated decision. I didn't have community in academia, and I knew this is what I had been missing for so many years, and I couldn't walk away from that.
I love it. So you build the skill set. Tell us about your first job in tech.
So I was really lucky, and I know that this is not most people's experience, but I had kind of documented my journey, both on Twitter and then through blogging, about my experience. And, you know, writing was kind of in my wheelhouse because I was a college English teacher. And so I just had started writing for myself, no comments, not doing any tracking, who's paying attention to my blogs. None of that matters to me. So when it came time, when I graduated boot camp, I put out a tweet. I'm looking for a job. Wasn't looking for full-time. I was looking for contract work. I had a couple of conditions. I wanted part-time, flexible, meaningful work. I think those were the 3. And so
part-time, flexible, meaningful.
Yeah.
I love that. Okay.
And so somebody reached out to me and said, hey, it sounds like we're on the same page and we would be a good fit to work together. And so it met 2 of them. It met flexible and part-time. And I talked to my career coach and I said, you know, like it doesn't meet that 3rd one. She's like, you don't have to have all 3 in one place. And I feel like this was prophetic for what the rest of my career would hold, because I ended up finding meaningful work through the community that I started, Virtual Coffee. But it was not on the radar then, but it was really important to hear her say that. And so I was able to work contract work until the pandemic hit, and then we both lost our jobs for a while. But it was really great to have that experience of learning and growing as a contract worker and to better understand. He hired me as a front-end developer, which I thought I would do back-end. And I really hated React and JavaScript, but I was like, well, I'm going to go for it because
why not?
It's here. And that's still the stack that I'm working in today.
Oh, I love it. Let's back up to something you kind of glossed over that I know is important. And as a coach myself, I believe in it, but I like to hear why other people do. So you say, hey, I talked to my career coach. Why did you choose to work with a career coach making that transition and looking for the first roles?
They offered as part of our boot camp career coaching. And so I definitely wanted to take them up on that. But also, the educational mentor that I mentioned earlier, who had been run over by the semi truck,
Hmm.
she and I still meet regularly for career coaching. And I find it incredibly valuable, especially for me. I'm a real overthinker. And sometimes I have a hard time really discerning what is the right path for me, especially in terms of I never expected to be in this career. If you would have asked me 6 years ago, like, where do you see yourself in 5 years? It definitely would not be here. And so having someone help me to identify what that path looked like, understanding what my strengths and my weaknesses are, and how I can approach that job search and finding a place that's meaningful for me was really important. It's not just about the work, it's about the whole experience and the community and the people that I'm working with. And so also to be able to have that input and insight into potential issues and ways to talk about those things and to figure out if this is a good place for me to work, not just a job that I would enjoy, is really invaluable.
Mm-hmm. Bekah, what I've seen in my own journey with coaching, being coached myself, I have several coaches and still work with them to this day. And a lot of times people get surprised by that. Like, why do you need a coach now? You have a successful business, things are going great. You are a coach. Like, what's the point? And I have seen it over time, every time. I always perform at my best when I'm able to take those conversations that you just mentioned to an outside party who has the experience, who's already done the things that I want to do, can bring that lens, or even just from the perspective of great questions and thought provoking coaching, even if they've never done what I want to do. My coaches help me accelerate. And my mantra is, the best players have the best coaches. Olympians have coaches, athletes have coaches. Why would I not have a coach? And so it's awesome just to hear your perspective on that. Appreciate what you're saying. So, which, by the way, are you still meeting with that person?
Yeah, I still meet with my, after I was laid off in January, I think the very next week, I met with my educational coach to walk through. I'm like, Katie, I don't know what I'm doing.
What do I do? Yeah. Awesome.
There are lots of different paths in front of me and I'm freaking out. She's like, all right, it's fine. Let's meet tomorrow or
Exactly.
whatever.
See, another great reason to just always have a coach. You never know when life's going to throw you that unexpected curveball, and then you can make that phone call and you just like back on track so quickly.
Absolutely.
So, okay, you're working this first part-time role, and you made mention of this community that launched Virtual Coffee, and that's actually a big part of how we ended up connected. Is one of my past guests, Eric Anderson. He after the show mentioned you and this group called Virtual Coffee, and I was like, I need to meet this amazing Bekah. What is this all about? So when did that start, and what is Virtual Coffee?
Virtual Coffee is an intimate group of people in tech who are at all stages of their journey. So it doesn't have to be developers, but it can be writers, it could be project managers, but anybody who's interested in that space. And we come together and we meet up a couple of times a week, but we're trying to empower people to be leaders, to embrace the journey where they're at, and to be comfortable in participating in ways that work for them. So that last part is important to me because I think if you want to be a lurker all day. I am a lurker in many groups, and I think it is totally fine just to take in what everything is going on. It started because on the day that I lost my job, my first job, I had actually been picking up my kids' schoolwork because they said, hey, there's this thing called COVID that's going around and we're going to shut down for 3 weeks while it resolves itself.
3 weeks.
Yeah, which
It's
did
funny
not
to,
happen.
yeah. Going back to those conversations in March 2020, it is funny how many of those, for a couple weeks or just until this blows over, we look back now and think, wow, were we wrong?
Yes, right. So they sent 3 weeks worth of work home, and then the kids never went back to school.
Never went back.
And so then I got home with their schoolwork, found out that I didn't have a job, and then I was just
Oh,
at a low
same
point.
day, just bang, bang.
I got my Slack message from the guy that I was working with while I was picking up the books, like, hey, when you get in, like, let's have a chat. And it wasn't a total shock because at that point, people were starting to panic and there were layoffs. I had actually been on the phone with my dad and I said, I wouldn't be surprised if I lose my job because I am the most junior person here and what I'm doing is not mission critical. But we both lost our jobs for a while. And so I just, was like rock bottom for a while, trying to school at home. And then I was really interviewing for the first time ever because we had a conversation about working together. There was no whiteboards, there were not behavioral interviews. And I remember I was just like crying every night. My husband was working 2 jobs at that time. And I was in an interview and my son, one of my kids, walked by my computer, opened the door to my bathroom, and peed with the door open.
Oh, wow. In the background of an interview.
This is, I mean, you couldn't see anything, but you could definitely hear it. Like, this is absurd. There's no other way to describe this experience. Like, what are we doing? And so then it kind of hit me. I'm like, oh, wait a minute. This sadness, this loneliness, this emptiness, I know these feelings. I've been through this before. This is trauma, and I'm not the only person that's going through it. We're all going through it right now. I'm not the only person that feels this way. And so then I put out a tweet and said, does anybody want to meet up for virtual coffee? That was in April of 2020. And we're still going strong today. We had a meeting this morning. But what I found was it wasn't just, at first I thought this is just a pandemic thing. People want to get together. But then during our first Hacktoberfest, which would have been October of 2020, Hacktoberfest is a month-long investment into open source contribution that's sponsored by DigitalOcean. And if you sign up and get 4 pull requests, you can get some swag. So we ran an event and everybody was so excited to participate. The connections that were made in that moment and seeing people so proud of the work that they did of completing Hacktoberfest for the first time or the 5th time, it didn't matter. Everybody was so positive and supportive. And I thought, oh, this is not a pandemic thing. We need community all the time. And not everybody can have in-person community. I couldn't have in-person community because of my responsibilities with my kids, because of my location. We all need different options. And so this is something that's going to continue to happen. And we're going to continue to learn and grow and support each other through this no matter what. And so this is why we're still continuing to do virtual coffee. And it was meaningful because it got a lot of us through those experiences in the pandemic, but it's getting us through other things. It's getting us through layoffs, through emotional challenges. It's getting us through those experiences where we're excited, where we can cheer each other on. It's all of these things, embracing the full humanity of all of our members. Because we're not just developers, we're human beings first.
Yes.
And that's what's important to us, to recognize the person before we even think about any other part of it.
Yeah. Yep. I tell my clients, we're not engineers who happen to be human. We're humans who happen to be engineers. And I love that statement. We all need community. We call our client base the Waco family for that reason. It's like there's something special about being able to pick up the phone or set up a virtual coffee with people who are like-minded and care about the same things that you care about and support each other. But Bekah, take this then, this kind of shadow of the past. I've had these emotions before. I've experienced this in my life in a different context. And you were able to see that and take action. What would you distill this down to that are the key takeaways? Or for someone who might be in that place, what do you do first? What's maybe the signals that you're going through or you're in the middle of trauma in this way? And how would you encourage someone to take action to change that trajectory in their own life?
So I'm going to take you back to my conversation with my educational coach, Katie McKenna. At one point, I told her the month of November is NaNoWriMo, National Novel Writing Month in the United States. And my past in English, I've always been fascinated by that. You try and write 50,000 words during the month of November. And so I started writing my story. And I said, Katie, I don't know why I'm writing my story, but I am. And she said, Bekah, we don't tell our stories for ourselves. we tell them to invite other people to share their stories with us. And that hugely impacted my life, because when we share, it's not about us. It's about opening up and creating human connection with other people. So when you feel lonely, when you feel hurt, you're not the only one that's felt that way. And it might be a different circumstance. It might be a totally different experience, but sharing that story allows us to connect to other people and to remember that we're not alone. Because when you feel isolated, when you feel like you're the only person that can understand that, that's when we start to go to really dark places. And human beings are not meant to be alone. They're meant to be in communion with other people and to be able to share those experiences. So I'd say, like, when you start to feel that way, that's when you start to share or you talk to somebody about it.
What a powerful message. We don't share our story for ourselves. And what's interesting, Bekah, is my immediate reaction was going to be, we share it for other people, but that's not it. It's we share it to invite them to share theirs. That's really powerful, really powerful. So get connected, start sharing. Is there any maybe wrong way to do that? Anything you've seen or learned in your own experience that you would say, here's a productive or fruitful way to approach this, but don't do things like this, it won't help you?
Okay, so along this, I've given a talk on the power of storytelling, and the last section of that talk is about listening. And I think that that's incredibly important. And that's one of those things that doesn't maybe seem quite intuitive. Like, you're telling me to share my story, but now you're telling me to stop talking. Like, yes.
Make up your mind, Bekah.
When somebody shares their story, that's your opportunity to listen and connect. And when I mean by listen, I don't mean listen to respond to them. You shouldn't be thinking about, what am I going to say next? Oh, I have a story that I can share too. Listen to understand what they're talking about, ask questions, but the focus should not be on yourself. And I would say, like, that's the biggest thing. I know that it can be really challenging and people want to relate and they want to share like empathy. And I was once telling the story of what I went through with my labor and delivery. And this woman said, this is not the same, but one time I had an infected tooth. And I was like, that is not the same. I understand you're trying to relate to me and I appreciate that. And, for me, like, it was okay. By that point, it was able to recognize that, look, she's just trying to be a part of this conversation and understand me. But, it depends on the person and where they're at in their journey and what they've just shared with you. If they've just shared something like really intimate and emotional, and your response is focused on you and not in a way that really relates to them, then you're going to, rather than creating a connection, you're going to create like a barrier between the two of you. So I think that it's important to listen with the intent of understanding that person's experience, but also recognizing that you probably can never totally understand their experience. You can connect through those experiences, but it's never going to be the same thing.
Yeah. Such wise insight. And it's a good thing I didn't tell you about my stubbed toe from the weekend earlier in our conversation. I thought about it. I'm kidding. No, that's super, super important to recognize, especially when we haven't really done our own inner work or developed in terms of emotional and social intelligence. There's that temptation that comes across from a good intention of relating, but it may also be driven by some insecurity or ego or this part of you that also needs to feel like an equal participant in, Bekah had this really big trauma. Let me tell you about my big trauma so that we can do this together. And it's like, resist that urge. Let that be their time to share, your time to listen. Can we relate this back to technology then? I'm so excited because I see the connection, but I want to see how you relate them. How has everything that you just told us about in your journey maybe it made you better at what you do, or how it's drawn in this passion and the work that you do in technology now? How would you relate these two parts of your story?
Yeah, I think it's definitely impacted where I am now. I spent some time doing developer community work, and now I'm a developer experience lead at Open Source. And for me, that's all about understanding the person. The developer experience recognizes the person first and the challenges that they might be going through, and is open to looking at those different perspectives to figure out how to best empower and equip those people. You can't do that without listening, and you make those connections through storytelling. And I'm like very big on the storytelling aspect of things. I think that in tech, we have this tendency to kind of distill things down and just want to be very bland and technical. And we don't find value in being able to communicate through stories. But in fact, stories are way more effective at communicating information, getting people on board with your mission, helping to onboard new employees, than it is to hand them a technical documentation, a PowerPoint that you read off of, or anything that's really distilled down to those main points. And so for me, you tell those stories because you want that connection. And that's kind of been that whole experience. You have to look at the person. How do you connect with people? You connect with people through stories. You connect with them through listening. And then you take that and you work on it, because it's not easy, right? Like somebody, a while back, I was talking about empathy, and I mentioned to them, empathy is a skill that you work on. It's not you're born with empathy or you're not, and that's how you live your life. It's hard. I would say 7 years ago, before I went through trauma, I was not a very empathetic person. And then I had to. I couldn't stand on my own. Like I needed help. So I was forced to be empathetic, like to understand it a little bit more, because I was the recipient of so much empathy. And then my life clicked a lot more. And so that is a skill that you work on. Sometimes I find that like maybe I'm not being empathetic enough, and I have to pause and remind myself, like, this is an opportunity for you to lead with empathy and not think about, you know, the other paths that you might go down to approach this person. So, you know, these are skills.
Whew. I'm just picturing myself as, you know, a director or a VP of an engineering organization, or maybe a technical co-founder, building my team around a startup, and think about choosing between developers or any engineer who is masterful in the craft of writing lines of code or knows their technical skill set in mechanical engineering like the back of their hand, but one of them has this ability to listen, share empathy, who's got the human centric aspect of their work, loves community, knows how to be resourceful and reach out for help when they need it, and leads in that way. Like, which of the two do you want to hire? Who do you want to build the team around? It's really an obvious question. And so I think this is awesome for everybody, for myself included, to think, how do we always complement our development around not just the technical acumen, and use a conversation like this one, Bekah, to say, I don't need to go through trauma like Bekah did to take action to develop in these areas. You know, we can learn from your story. And so thank you for your courage and vulnerability to share it today. Really amazing.
Oh, I really appreciate you giving me the opportunity. And, you know, going back to what you talked about with having coaches, this is another opportunity to bring a coach in. If you're not good at storytelling, if you're not good at communicating, if you're not good at listening, there are people out there that will help you with that and make you a more effective leader. And I'm 100% on board with making that normalized in anything that we do.
Absolutely. Well, Bekah, where can the happy engineer who's been with us in this conversation get connected to you, the amazing new work that you're doing? What's the best way to follow Bekah?
Well, you can always follow me on Twitter. I am still there and prolifically tweeting. I'm at Bekah HW for Hawrot Weigel, and I'm also on LinkedIn.
Amazing. We will absolutely put links to you in the show notes. I highly encourage everyone to go out and follow Bekah and check out what's happening with Virtual Coffee. It's a really amazing community. I know at times there's a wait list because it's such a high demand place to be, but if you're a developer and you want to get plugged in with that, please reach out and make that happen. And I have no doubt, Bekah, you're going to continue to make waves in this world with your heart and your passion for it. So I'm excited to follow where it all builds and goes. To land the plane then, I'm excited to hear your perspective about this question. We talked about coaching, we've talked about developing engineering. They all have in common that the questions we ask lead and the answers follow. So if we want better answers if we want to be happier at work, we want meaningful work, we want to build those careers, whatever it is, we need to ask better questions. So, what would be the question that you would lead the happy engineer with today?
I think that you have to start with, what do you value the most and why do you value that? Because you have to understand what you want out of things before you can find the answer to those things, right? Like, you can't find a new job and expect it to be a good job if you don't know what you want yourself.
What do you value most and why do you value it? Bekah, that's amazing. Thank you so much again for your generosity today, for your courage to share everything about your life and story. I know so many people are going to be impacted and inspired to action from what you just shared. So thank you so much. Awesome to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me, Zach.